And so jumping right into Proverbs here, chapter 1, it says here, these are the Proverbs of Solomon, David's son, king of Israel. And so if there's any, wonder who wrote the book of Proverbs, it's from Solomon, even though we'll see by the end there's two other contributors, Agur and I forget his other name. But there's two other guys that also contribute the last two chapters of Psalms, Lemuel. And who those people are, we don't really know. We know their names and who their dad was, and that's about it. So, but for the most part, we'll see that these are the Proverbs of Solomon. And it's no surprise, right? Because if you remember the story of Solomon, right, he's famous for what? Asking the Lord for wisdom, right? God said, hey, gave him a blank check. Solomon, what do you want? And Solomon's like, Lord, I want to have wisdom. But actually, if you study it out a little closer, you see there in 1 Kings 3, he actually asked for to know right from wrong, which I think is a pretty interesting definition of wisdom. And we're actually going to sort of see as we go through the Proverbs where wisdom and knowledge and understanding kind of interact. And so often I think people kind of look at the dictionary definition of what wisdom is, and they'll say it's the application of knowledge. And then you're like, yeah, that's what our definition is, not necessarily what the Bible's definition is. And I think it's one of those scenarios where you're going to find out that it's not very clearly delineated. I think so often in our society and our approach to the Bible is to kind of clearly delineate. You hear a lot of pastors, okay, we're going to meet together, we're going to reconcile all these things and put them in their nice little buckets. And it's like, yeah, actually, if you study it out, a lot of these things are so intermingled. It's like, where does one start and one end? It's not very clear, right? Because to know right from wrong, well, sometimes knowledge can help you with that, but sometimes God can also just lead you that can then, through wisdom, to get more knowledge. Like, for example, with Solomon's first story there, right after he asked for wisdom, is a story of these two women, and they both have a baby, and then one baby dies. And then they both claim that the live baby is theirs. And, of course, Solomon, is given that supernatural wisdom, and there he says, bring me a sword, and I'm going to cut this live baby in half. And the real mother says, no, let the baby live, right? And the liar said, no, let's cut the baby in half. That sounds fair. And you're like, wait, what's going on here? Right? It's kind of a crazy story, but God gave that supernatural wisdom to Solomon, and he said, and now he realized, okay, wait, the one who wants the baby to stay alive was the real mother. And so you can see there how wisdom led to more knowledge. So you're like, okay, wait, how does that work? Wisdom led to knowledge, but then if God had just instead given Solomon wisdom, then he would have known the right thing to do, the knowledge of who the right mother was, supernaturally, right? So it's like, wait a second, where does one start? Where's one? And it's kind of confusing because the Bible sometimes kind of uses it interchangeably. And so if you're kind of confused like me, don't worry, we're all together. Where it's kind of like, okay, wait, they're kind of just intermingled, and so you got to watch out for that. And so, so that's just kind of a thing to keep in mind as you're kind of going through the Proverbs. And but I do like that idea. If you go back to 1 Kings 3, you'll see it, right? Just knowing right from wrong, I think is a pretty good definition, at least to start with. But now back in Proverbs here, verse 2. Their purpose, that is these Proverbs, right, is to teach people wisdom and discipline, to help them understand the insights of the wise. Their purpose is to teach people to live disciplined and successful lives, to help them do what is right, just, and fair. And so it's one of those books where it says you very clearly the purpose, right, to live these certain ways, a life of wisdom, but also here it says it twice here, to teach discipline, which is interesting, right, to live that life of self-control. It says in I forget if it's 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy, but in the Bible, in the Timothys, that we are not given a spirit of fear and timidity, but a spirit of what? Power, love, and self-discipline. Christians, we should be those that are disciplined. Discipline and self-discipline in particular is a godly trait. Say, you know what, I'm going to live a disciplined, careful life, a life of obedience, a life that's not sloppy, right? You see in Timothy, it also talks about, we're these soldiers for Christ, right? We're in this army. Right, and if you have anything about the military, right, discipline's important, right? And so I think we need to watch out because our society is so the opposite, right? They're like, do whatever you want and whatever you feel like, and don't discipline kids, don't discipline anybody. Yeah, just do whatever you want. It's like, no. We got to watch out. We don't take our society's ideas and values and apply it to our walk with the Lord. The Lord would have us to live lives that are disciplined. It's a good thing. It's the right thing to do. It's a godly trait to live a self-disciplined life. And then notice there in that verse 3 there that we had just read, it's what? To live disciplined and successful lives. So those things go hand in hand. And I don't know about you, but I want to live a successful life, right? I want to have that success. Well, it comes from, in part, living a wise life and a wise and disciplined life. And then you'll be blessed with a successful life, spiritually speaking at least, right? And now in verse 4, and these proverbs will give insight to the simple, knowledge and discernment to the young. And so for those of us that are simple, which is all of us, by the way, right? We're all naive. We all can learn and grow more, and we all are, actually fools. If you read, I think it's in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 or 2, it says God chose what the foolish things of this world, us, to shame the wise. So now when people see us and they say, hey, wait, wow, this person, there's some wisdom in you. That's not me, right? That's all the Lord, right? I'm just reading through Acts there, and they saw the disciples and like, hey, these disciples, they're not trained. Or we would say today, they're not educated. And yet there's something special about them. And they have this boldness. And it says there, and they realized they had been with Jesus, right? And so there's something special about us, but it's not ourselves, but it's the Lord who's working in us. And part of how we do that is, we study the Proverbs. We study God's word, and it'll give us insight that we might have knowledge and discernment and insight. Now in verse 5, let the wise listen to these proverbs and become even wiser. Let those with understanding receive guidance by exploring the meaning in these proverbs and parables, the words of the wise and their riddles. And so notice this is for the wise and understanding already to what? To grow. And so even if you are a wise person, you can always grow. And you say, well, no, duh, right? You would think that, but sometimes people think, well, I got it figured out and I'm good. It's like, no, that's a foolish trait. And we're actually going to see that's a theme in the Psalms, that fools are not going to want to grow, but wise people are always looking to grow in wisdom, to grow in insight, to grow in knowledge. And so if you want to find or be a wise person, we'll always be ready to listen. It sort of baffles me that people don't listen. Like, I know it sounds dumb, but like, you never know. Even if the person you think is wrong, listen a little bit. You never know. They might test your, assumptions, and they may be dead wrong, or you might get a little nugget of wisdom. Even sometimes goofballs can get something right. You never know, right? A wise person's always just trying to grow in wisdom and listen for more wisdom. And so even if you are wise, you can grow from this studying of the Proverbs as well. And then verse 7, a very famous verse here, right? The fear of the Lord is the foundation of true knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. And so you see right off the bat, right? Fools despise it. They don't want wisdom. They don't want discipline. They don't want any of that. And you're like, yep, that pretty much describes our society, right? They don't want to do the right thing. And discipline, forget it. They hate it. They despise it. And that's what fools do. But in contrast, right, the fear of the Lord is that foundation of true knowledge. And so without that, you're going to find, without that foundation, things are shaky. And sure enough, that's what our culture is, right? They don't have that foundation. We deny the Lord, right? Look at the so-called scientists, the so-called experts. I had to Google it. They don't really have real estimates. How many pages are written on evolution? It's probably in the millions and millions. It's too many to count, right? And you're like, that's so stupid, right? That's so nonsense, but it's because they're missing that foundation of true knowledge. It's as silly as if, the smartest people in the world got together and said, hey, the tooth fairy is real, and let's write 1,000 books on it. You're like, that's crazy talk, right? Well, that's how crazy evolution is, right? Because we have the Bible, right? Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Done. It's right there for us, right? Simple, right? And so without that foundation, you find out, oh, wow, people are just confused. People are off the rails. And so don't be surprised because they're missing that foundation, which is the fear of the Lord. But now we're going to switch gears a little bit as Solomon here addresses his child or his son. In verse 8, it says, my child, listen to when your father corrects you. Don't neglect your mother's instruction. What you learn from them will crown you with grace and be a chain of honor around your neck. And so we see there's a blessing for what? For walking in obedience to your parents. For the children, particularly, right? Like, hey, children, listen to your parents. Or if you go to the 10 Commandments, the only commandment with a promise of blessing is the one that says, honor your father and mother. And then you will have that long, or we might say full and blessed life. And so there's just a special blessing when you obey your parents, when you honor your parents. And so Solomon says, hey, kiddo, hey, son, make sure you obey your parents. It's going to be a blessing to you if you do. And then in verse 10, my child, if sinners entice you, turn your back on them. And so we see here just the warning of what? Of peer pressure. Of, as we know in 1 Corinthians, right? Bad company corrupts. It's going to happen. And in particular, you could say, especially for kids. I know it's been a while since many of us were kids, right? But if you remember being a kid, man, peer pressure was so much more powerful, right? Because you cared so much about what people thought. oh no, I want to dress the same way as them. I got to have the same haircut. I got to have the same this, and I got to use the language, and I got to be funny, and I got to be, well, and you cared so much. And then you look back, like, 10 years later, being a little smarter and wiser, and you're like, what was I doing? We were all dorks. We were all such weirdos, right? Like, but we thought we were so cool because we did whatever. Like, it's so silly, right? But the peer pressure is very dangerous. And so we see the Lord yet again warning us, children especially, but I think all of us, hey, watch out for peer pressure. Watch out. Because bad company corrupts. And so it's a warning from the Lord. The Lord's crying out to us. As we'll see, wisdom cries out to us, hey, watch out, because it's going to be your hurt if you are around those who will bring you down into sin. And we're going to see a bit of these people here in a moment. But kind of a couple more points and we'll move on here. If you go to that verse, it's in 2 Corinthians 6. I forget my references today. It's in the Bible. I'm just terrible with references. Right, we know that verse, older translations say, don't be unequally yoked, right? Or we would say, I like how the NLT translates it, don't team up with unbelievers. Don't be doing life with unbelievers is the idea. And it says there, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, you being linked up to an unbeliever is absurd as Jesus being linked up with Satan, right? And you're like, that's crazy, right? It sounds like a bad joke, but imagine you go into a coffee shop and there's Jesus and Satan just hanging out, shooting the breeze. You'd be like, am I in the absurd land? That's just totally crazy. And that's the example that God gives of us being linked with unbelievers. It's totally absurd. It's totally crazy. It's totally just out of left field and should not happen. And yet, sad to say, I think so many Christians don't heed these warnings. And we can be say, oh yeah, what's the big deal? They're my, fill in the blank. They're my old friend. They're my family member. They're whoever. And it's like, whoa. Can Satan and Jesus have fellowship? No. That's not how it's supposed to be. And so we need to be very careful because, as we'll see in a moment, it's a very dangerous thing. Instead, what we should do is, I like that 2 Timothy 2, if you want to flip there real quick. I think this should be a good little litmus test for us. In 2 Timothy 2, verse 22, which is on page 1002 in my Bible. Yeah, it's nice. It's 2 Timothy 2:22. All twos. It says here, run from anything that stimulates youthful lust. Instead, pursue righteous living, faithfulness, love, and peace. And then notice this part here. Enjoy the companionship of those who call on the Lord with pure hearts. And so it's that last part especially, right? Of, hey, we need to make sure we enjoy the companionship of those who what? Call on the Lord with pure hearts. So not perfection, right? Because otherwise that excludes all of us. None of us pass that, right? We're not talking about that. But we're talking about those people who are focused on the Lord. And so if I kind of paraphrase 2 Timothy 2 with 2 Corinthians 6, I would just say, if I'm going to be close to you, then you better be close to Jesus. Otherwise, I can't be close with you, right? That's why, honestly, I don't have very many close friends. I have no friends. I was thinking about man, I used to meet 5 people a week in college. I used to meet people I'm a yapper. I'll meet everybody. And it's I have very few friends. Well, why? Because the Lord has said in these scriptures, hey, you better only be close to people that are close to Jesus. And so if I could encourage you today, hey, go through the people in your life, the people that you spent, the last holidays with or the next holidays or the weekend and say, hey, is this person close to Jesus? Not just a Christian, right? But someone who's really focused on the Lord. Now, of course, the exception is if you're witnessing to somebody, of course, we're not talking about that, right? That's different. But those people that you're really just doing life with week in and week out, we need to make sure that those people are those who are close to Jesus if they're going to be close to us. Because as we see here in Proverbs 1, notice the warning continues on here in verse 11. It says, they may say, come and join us. Let's hide and kill someone. Just for fun, let's ambush the innocent. Let's swallow them alive like the grave. Let's swallow them whole like those who go down to the pit of death. Think of the great things we'll get. We'll fill our houses with all the stuff we take. Come and throw in your lot with us. We'll share all the loot. And so we see here the driving ambition of them is greed, right? They want to kill somebody and take their stuff. And you say, wow, this is a pretty extreme thing that's going on here. Stephen, I got this non-believer in my life, but I'm not that crazy. Well, you might say this is sort of extreme, but I think it kind of shows you the extreme warning that God is giving us. That, remember, this is Solomon to his son. So, to use today's language, you would say this is to a Christian who was raised in a Christian home. And yet Solomon is warning his son, hey, watch out. You may think you're so safe and secure, but if you're around people that are wicked, they might bring you down all the way down to murder. You're like, whoa, I didn't think my unbelieving friend was bringing me down that much. You don't know. And so the Lord is warning us very clearly to, hey, run. As it says here in verse 15, right? My child, don't go along with them. Stay far away from their paths. Run the other way. Stay far away. They rush to commit evil deeds. They hurry to commit murder. If a bird sees a trap being set, it knows to stay away. But these people set an ambush for themselves. They are trying to get themselves killed. Such is the fate of all who are greedy for money. It robs them of life. And so we see some interesting points here where, yes, we're to run away from them, but notice here it says here, they're trying to get themselves killed. They kind of know that it's wrong. Like, they're just living this flippant lifestyle. It kind of shows you that, they sort of know that they're not on the right path. And it kind of shows, like, even an animal kind of knows, but like they don't seem to know. They don't seem to get it. Like, what's going on here? And I kind of point this out because I think there's this misconception in the church that people don't know that they're in sin. And that if we just convince them, when we give them the right arguments and we explain to them how God is actually real and, creation is real and all these things, like, that'll suddenly convince them. And then you read in Scripture, it's like, no. Go read Romans 1. It says not that they don't know the truth, it's that they actively suppress it. It says in John 3 that they run from the light because it exposes their sin, and instead they love darkness. They choose their dark paths. And so, it's kind of like those people that, smoke cigarettes. It's very clear on the label. This causes cancer. This will kill you. I actually had a coworker many years ago, and she went to take her smoke, and she's like, yeah, let me go grab my cancer sticks or whatever. And then she says to me, unsolicited, by the way, she's like, I can quit anytime. And I'm like, how about today? I'll call her out, and she's like, no. Right? She knows. Like, she knows it's going to kill her. She knows it's going to hurt. And that was our banter, right? We were just goofing off. But that's with sin. Right? They say, oh, yeah, they kind of know, and they know it's a trap, and they know it's going to only hurt them, and this greed and this lust for money that they constantly have, and they're willing to kill to get it, and they know it's going to destroy them, and yet they will still do it. And so you're saying, oh, Stephen, that's very encouraging, so we can't convince them? Well, that's not our job. Our job is to go to the Lord and say, Lord, break these hard hearts, Lord. Break them down because I can't do it, right? No one can come to Jesus unless what? The Father draws them. And so it's not up to us to have, the perfect argument and to debate them and to do all those things. But instead, to say, Lord, break down those walls of the enemy that the people might then not love their darkness, but instead choose to come into the light. But now into verse 20. It says, wisdom shouts in the streets. She cries out in the public square. And so we're going to see in this sort of parable here that wisdom is personified as a woman, which a lot of them get very excited about, but don't get too excited because we get to the next chapter and, sexual morality is personified as a woman too. So, take your, you got a bit of both here. But no, she's crying out in the streets. That is wisdom. And then verse 21, she calls to the crowds along the main street, to those gathered in front of the city gate. How long, you simpletons, will you insist on being simple-minded? How long will you mockers relish your mocking? How long will you fools hate knowledge? Come and listen to my counsel. I'll share my heart with you and make you wise. And so it's very interesting, this idea of wisdom is shouting. Wisdom is so obvious in many times. It's very clear. And people sort of know it, and it's right there, if we would just listen. And yet, sad to say, of course we know, many don't listen, right? Because fools, they hate wisdom. They hate knowledge. And then notice in verse 24, I called you so often. So it wasn't just one time, but I called you so often, but you wouldn't come. I reached out to you, but you paid no attention. You ignored my advice and rejected the correction I offered. So it's not that people don't hear, or it's not that wisdom's not speaking. It's that people actively refuse to ignore it. Just like we were talking about a moment before, right? It's not that people don't know the truth or know what's right. They have chosen to ignore it. And so in verse 26, so I will laugh when you are in trouble. I will mock you when disaster overtakes you. When calamity overtakes you like a storm, when disaster engulfs you like a cyclone, and anguish and distress overwhelm you. When they cry for help, I will not answer. Though they anxiously search for me, they will not find me. For they hated knowledge and chose not to fear the Lord. They rejected my advice and paid no attention when I corrected them. And so these are some pretty harsh words. Wow, wisdom will mock you, right? If you don't listen, it's going to tell you, I told you so. Ouch. That's very humbling. And so it's trying to show this again, though, not to attack us, I think, but to warn us, to say, hey, listen now, right? The time to listen to wisdom is now. And then it says something very interesting here, where in verse 29, right? They chose not to fear the Lord. So when we ignore wisdom, we ignore what God is speaking to us, it's a spit in the face to God. It's choosing not to fear and respect the Lord. You might be not saying with your words, screw you, God. You might not be saying that with your words, but with your actions, you are, right? If the Lord says, hey, I want you to live this way, I want you to obey your parents, or I want you to, only be fellowshipping with believers, not be around unbelievers that are wicked. And you say, no, God, it's okay. Like, I got it. I'm just going to do my own thing. What you're doing is you are choosing not to fear the Lord. You are disrespecting the Lord. And you're saying, no, Stephen, I'm not doing that. But they're my friend, my family member. I just want to do my thing. It's like, whoa, no, this is a very serious thing. The Lord, again, is showing us how serious it is when we sin. And so often we make light of it, just saying, I probably should, not hang around this person. I probably should do whatever it is. It's like, no. Don't make light of your sin. Use the language the Bible uses here, and it says you're choosing to disrespect the Lord. You're choosing not to fear him. And so we need to take it seriously in that case, right? And then notice here the consequences when it comes in verse 31. Therefore, they must eat the bitter fruit of living their own way, choking on their own schemes. For simpletons turn away from me to death. Fools are destroyed by their own complacency. But all who listen to me will live in peace, untroubled by fear of harm. And so, ouch, right? You choose to live in foolishness. You choose to ignore wisdom. It's going to be bitterness, choking on your own schemes, death. And then notice there in verse 32, just destroyed by their own complacency, right? Just getting too relaxed, just getting too comfortable where we're at. So often we think of the worst sins of the sins of, commission and doing outwardly, wrong actions, right? Like, oh, and David committed adultery with Bathsheba, and we think that's like, some of the worst things. And yet when you see in scriptures, there's also these verses here where it's just complacency, just getting too comfortable. When God called you to do certain things and to step out and act, and you said, no, I'm not going to do it. You will also be destroyed by your own complacency. And so we need to watch out that we're listening to the Lord, that we're not destroyed by our inaction, not just by our foolish actions, but our foolish inaction as well. But in contrast, notice that last verse, though. If you're walking in wisdom, if you're living in wisdom, or listening to wisdom, what you will live in peace, untroubled by fear of harm. There's just something about when you're walking with the Lord, isn't it? Like that? Like, oh, yeah, life is hard. Life is tough. You have trials still, but there's just a peace, right, when you're walking with the Lord, right? At least for me, I know there's definitely a peace when, because you're having a hard time, you're having a trial, but, not perfect, of course, but you're walking with the Lord. At least the trial is just from Satan. It's not because of your own stupidity, right? It's not because you caused it. It's like, oh, it's just a Job situation, right? This is hard, but I'm at peace because I know it's not my own stupidity that got me into the situation. And there's just a peace in that. Or I think there's also a piece of, hey, if I'm walking in wisdom, I'm doing it God's way, then it's God's problem. And God's going to take care of it, right? It's not up to my strength. It's not up to my ability. And there's a great peace in that as well, right? Because the Lord is infinitely strong, unlike us. But now in chapter 2, verse 1. My child, listen to what I say and treasure my commands. Tune your ears to wisdom and concentrate on understanding. And so we see here that we're to tune in to what the Lord is speaking. It says there in 7 times in Revelations chapter 2 and 3 to the churches, will the church listen to what the Spirit is speaking to the churches? So again, we're seeing God is constantly speaking. That's not the question. The question is, are we listening? Are we tuning our ears? I think of those old radios, right? And they wouldn't have quite, a hard stop and stop, end like the new digital ones. So you had to tune it in, right, to the right frequency. Is your antenna up? My family was pretty poor growing up, and so I had a old Walkman, and the antenna on it was pretty lousy. So I used to have to put my headphones up and string it around my window, to get the right frequencies. And so that's what I think of when I think of this tuning in, right? God's speaking, but is my antenna up? Am I dialed into the right frequency to say, okay, Lord, am I listening to you? Or am I tuned into my own ideas and my own cares, my own worries, and my career and my whatever thing that I'm doing that's going on, and my relationships and all these other things that are distracting me? It's like, wait a second, I'm not hearing the Lord. Oh, wait, stop. Tune in. Treasure his commands. They should be treated like a special Treasure of the Lord. Not something that we should take loosely, but we need to be tuning in. If you're about to hear, you can imagine, I hate those get rich quick schemes, but let's say they were real, right? Let's say someone's, hey, here's actually a secret passcode. You can make $1 million. Treasure is there. If you would just listen, here's the secret passphrase. You can be sure you'd be listening pretty intently, right? Well, that's what we should be doing with God's word and what God's speaking to us. Hey, tune in very clearly because God has wisdom that will lead to that, that successful life. And so we need to treasure it and make sure that we're tuned in. And then notice in verse 3, it says, cry out for insight and ask for understanding. And so we to just ask the Lord for it, right? It says in James 1 that if you ask for wisdom, God will give it to you. And I like that verse 3 though too, where it says also not just ask, but cry out for it, right? Do it with that intensity, that sincerity. I don't know why in our church we have this idea where, not our church, like the church, more holistically, capital C church, they think that the more fancy the language, the more spiritual, right? And you're like, what do you know? Right? We were just reading through the Psalms, that same idea, right? Just cry out, Lord, help. Lord, I need you, right? No, not Lord, help us, dear, your dearest children, oh Father out in heaven. Like, no, that's nonsense, right? Lord, when I'm in trouble, Lord, help me. Cry out for it. Do that with an intensity and sincerity. It's how we're to cry out to the Lord. And then notice the next part here in verse 4. Search for them as you would for silver. Seek them like hidden treasures. And so it's an asking, but also an action, right? It's an effort. When I prepare for Bible study, I could just, not prepare at all and just kind of show up and say, you know what, Lord, just help me have the right insights as I, read Proverbs for the first time maybe this month or this year. You could do that. It's like, well, no. We see often in Scripture this asking the Lord, but also the preparation. I think perhaps the, best example I can think of in the Scriptures is when you see them go to fight the battles, right? They would say, Lord, please help us with victory. And then what they would do, they would pick up their swords and they'd start swinging, right? It's that, asking the Lord for help, but then also having the action. And notice the action here is what? It's searching like you would for silver. I don't know much about mining, but I imagine it's brutal, hard work, right? I mean, I've dug some holes in my day, not very deep ones, just, for fences and stuff. And boy, it's the worst. I don't know how people do it. Man, it is just, you dig like 3 inches and you hit a rock. And you get to that rock and you hit another rock. Right? It's this effort. It's this hard thing. And that's the picture that's given us here of, hey, when you want to really grow in wisdom, you want to really grow with the Lord, it's going to be work. It's going to be labor. Don't be confused, right? We're not talking about salvation. Salvation's free, paid for. Wisdom, we got to work at it and cry out to the Lord for it. And I do find it kind of cool where he says, ask for what? Ask for silver. And if you remember during Solomon's day, what was silver like? It was like rocks. Why? Because it was so common. And that's what it's supposed to be like in the church. It actually says in a couple of places in the Scriptures that God's Spirit is a spirit of wisdom. And so if we're really having God's Spirit in us, we should be people of wisdom. And so, kind of interesting little thing there, right? We have to be people that are filled with wisdom if we're, asking the Lord and searching for it, digging for it like silver. And so notice in verse 5, if you do those two things, if you ask and you dig, then you will understand what it means to fear the Lord, and you will gain knowledge of God. For the Lord grants wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He grants a treasure of common sense to the honest. He is a shield to those who walk with integrity. He guards the path of the just and protects those who are faithful to him. And so, and so notice here, it's a promise from the Lord, right? If we're those who both ask and dig, then the Lord will give you that knowledge, right? You'll grow in the knowledge of the Lord. You'll grow in the, and learn to know what it means to fear the Lord, and you'll grow in all these ways. And then notice also it's going to guard you. It's a protection. And then I really like that verse 7, right? That treasure of common sense. When you're young and naive, right? You think, man, common sense should be common. And then you grow up like 5 minutes later, like, oh man, common sense is highly uncommon, right? It is a treasure. And so it's a treasure that particularly comes from the Lord. And so it's no wonder that so few people have it today, unfortunately, because they're not listening to the Lord. And then verse 9, then you will understand what is right, just, and fair, and you will find the right way to go. And that's a really good one. I really like that one, right? Where so often people are saying, which way do I go? right? Life is full of decisions, right? It feels like every day I'm making another decision about my life, right? And sometimes they're big ones. And I'm like, I don't know the right way to go. I don't know what I'm doing. Well, go back to those verses 3 and 4, right? We need to be those crying out to the Lord and searching for it. And then God will give you the answer, the right way to go, the wisdom for which way you should go. And then verse 10, for wisdom will enter your heart and knowledge will fill you with joy. Wise choices will watch over you. Understanding will keep you safe. And so if you are one that's constantly crying out, constantly asking the Lord for wisdom and searching for it, it's going to lead to what? Being filled with wisdom and knowledge that will fill you with joy. And so we see yet again, as if you're one just walking with the Lord, there's a joy in it, right? If you're one who's faithful to, you know what, digging in day after day in the Word, seeking from the Lord's wisdom, you'll find it will be a blessing to you. It will fill you with joy. And then verse 12, wisdom will save you from evil people, from those whose words are twisted. These men turn from the right way to walk down dark paths. They take pleasure in doing wrong, and they enjoy the twisted ways of evil. Their actions are crooked, and their ways are wrong. And so we see yet again just the protection of wisdom from wickedness, from the enemy. But notice here in verse 14, what? They take pleasure in doing wrong. They take pleasure in evil. I think sometimes we sort of have those rose-colored glasses looking at people, and our society thinks, the right circumstances and the right conditions, everyone's just good, right? Everything's okay, and it's really just blame whatever, poverty, blame this, bad upbringing, blame trauma, whatever it is, right? It's like, no, we are born sinners. This flesh loves to sin. Don't be deceived. And so watch out for those people, right? And don't worry, wisdom, God will protect us if we walk in his ways and walk in wisdom. Now in verse 16, wisdom will save you from the immoral woman, from the seductive words of the promiscuous woman. She has abandoned her husband and ignores the covenant she made before God. Entering her house leads to death. It is the road to the grave. The man who visits her is doomed. He will never reach the paths of life. And so we see here, as we're going to see in a number of other places in Proverbs, and it's just that particular warning about sexual promiscuity, how do you say that word? Promiscuousness. Just being loose with sex. Just saying, what's the big deal? Which is definitely our society, right? It's so sad because, we used to be so careful. You watch the old shows, right? And they had to they couldn't even share a bed, and they're a couple. Like, they were so, you couldn't say the word pregnant, right? Which is, you're like, that seems kind of almost like a little, puritanical. It seems a little too crazy. But I'd rather be on that side versus what we have today, right? Where people are just so loose with that. And here the Lord's giving us a very special warning. Hey, watch out for sexual sin. Watch out. In 1 Corinthians 6, it says, all sin's bad, yes, but sexual sin, you sin against your own body. Or the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, talking about that homosexuality, right? That's where we see the Lord pull out fire. And he's like, this place has to be obliterated because it is just so disgusting. It is so nasty. I'm going to obliterate this sexual sin, particularly homosexuality in that case. And then you see the next mention of homosexuality there, and I think it's near the end of Judges. And you see a sort of similar circumstance where just massive killing that has to happen because of just the sexual sin there. And so the Lord is saying, hey, watch out. Yet again, run away. Stay away from the promiscuous woman. Stay away from the promiscuous people. Don't go near it. Why? Because the house leads to death. It leads to the grave. But instead, in contrast, notice in verse 20, follow the steps of good men instead, and stay on the paths of the righteous. For only the godly will live in the land, and those with integrity will remain in it. But the wicked will be removed from the land, and the treacherous will be uprooted. And so if you want to be that person that's established in the land, or we would say the promised land, right? That's what Psalm is talking about. You want to be in that place of blessing where the Lord is. Well, you need to follow the good examples. And in particular, for all of us can be an example, women for other women and women for everybody, of course, and particularly for kids. But notice here, I think it's particular for the men, especially us here. Hey, we're to be the spiritual leaders. God has called us to say, hey, make sure you are blazing the trail. I always get so convicted when I think of that verse from Paul, who says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And I'm like, man, I want to be able to say that. I want to be able to have that, where I could say, hey, someone says, hey, how to live a Christian life? Copy me. And not in pride, but to say, I'm such an example. Watch me, and I'll show you how to imitate Christ. So you can see it firsthand. Like, that's how I want to live. And so that's for us to do, to live that disciplined life where, you know what, the way I walk is going to be just like Christ, to be very serious about it. You know, the people that I hang around with, you can hang around them too because they're godly examples. I'm going to follow the Proverbs. You know, I find it so interesting here as we're starting this book of wisdom here in this book of Proverbs. It sends here the first, third of chapter 1 there is on watching the people you hang around with. You know, I was thinking about, you know, sort of the opposite. A bad example is the guy Lot. Talk about not a good example you should follow in, right? He was a righteous guy, right? He was a Christian. And yet what happened? He compromised by being around ungodly people. And rather than his family following in his footsteps, they followed the footsteps of the people that Lot had brought into their life, right? And that's how you see his wife dies and his daughters become so perverted. They're like, oh no, there's no men around. What do we do? Get their dad drunk and have sex with them? Like, what's going on? And so, where's it going with this? Lot is an example of one who didn't listen to the Proverbs, didn't listen to the wisdom of, hey, bad company corrupts. And rather than following his example, they followed the example of the people around him. And, you know, that just was very convicting for me because, you know, God willing, one day I have a family. And I'm just like, man, what if my kids follow the example of the people I'm bringing around? Oh, that's a very sobering thing to think about, right? To say, wait, I got to make sure the people I'm hanging around are those that are close to Jesus, that are following him. Because what if they follow my example of, you know, they're my family member, but they're not a believer. And what if my kids follow in those footsteps instead? Like, oh no, like that would break my heart as a dad, right? That would break my heart if my wife is following their example and not following my example. And so, again, I hope you're hearing the warnings here that the Lord's giving us today. Hey, we need to be very careful. Because I think, again, sad to say, I think the church is very loose with this. You know, I see so many Christians, and I'm like, oh, yeah, where'd you spend Christmas? Oh, yeah, with this. And, oh, yeah. And then I hear some story, and I'm like, that's kind of a weird thing for a Christian to say, oh, they're not a Christian. Well, then why are you around them, right? And it's up to us, especially us men, to say, wait, no. We got to draw that line, right? Because, you know, maybe Lot was protected. Lot's in heaven, which is, again, a separate story. Very cool, right? God's so gracious. But his family? Doesn't seem like it, right? Because why? Because Lot compromised. And so we need to be very careful that the people that we're hanging around are godly examples. And so, you know, for me, my kids, you know, God willing, if I have kids one day, they're not going to really know most of my relatives. Because, you know, as much as my relatives are very lovely, as far as the world goes, they're not believers. Instead, I want them to have, you know, Uncle Daniel and Auntie Angel and Uncle Michael and Auntie Julia and, you know, Uncle Paul and Auntie Savannah. That's the people I want. Not perfect people, of course, none of us perfect. But people that, you know what? We go through the scriptures together. We follow God's word. And we miss the mark, but we're trying. We're drawing close to the Lord a little bit more every week. And so if I could encourage us men especially, hey, watch out. Because if you bring those people around, it's not just about you. Lot was safe. His family wasn't. They followed in the footsteps. And so we men especially need to be extra careful to set that godly example for our family, for those around us. Because as we were saying earlier, right, kids and others are very susceptible, even more so than us. Let's close in prayer, and then actually we're going to end in communion here.